When Columbus arrived in the Americas, he misnamed the inhabitants Indians, thinking he had arrived in India. He didn't. He found a place that Europeans had never been before, a whole new group of civilizations. But this nomenclature stuck for generations, as if everyone in the Americas were simply Indians, one peoples, different from Europeans, different from Asians. They were all the same. We get a little bit better with calling them Native Americans. This at least isolates them in the Americas. It also isolates them as being there before Columbus and descendants of people before Columbus. But it doesn't get to the heart of the matter, that the inhabitants of North and South America were incredibly diverse. And so we're going to focus on Native American diversity and look at ways to measure that. One way to measure that is with language groupings. People develop language in order to communicate with their neighbors. They're going to share a common language, common grammar, common words, if they interact on a daily or regular basis. The people that are least likely to share words and grammar are the people that don't interact, because the whole purpose of language is for people to get along and get what's in their head into someone else's head. If they don't interact on a regular basis, there's no need to share a common vocabulary. And so this map we have here is a map of the different language groups in North America. And so all of the different colors reflect the regions in which Native Americans circulated and shared a common language group. Now in French, they have the same thing. You have Parisian French. You have the different patois, such as provincial French. But here in Native America, with Native American languages, each of the languages can be distinctly studied for their own cultural differences. And so that we know the people in the southeastern part of the United States really didn't communicate and interact with people in the Great Basin or in the Rocky Mountains or on the Pacific Coast. That these people were relatively isolated from themselves on a day-to-day basis. They did interact through long-range trade, but it was not on a regular basis in which it would require them to develop a common language that was used for commerce. Another way to look at Native American diversity is to look at housing. Now, back when I was a kid, the stereotype was that Native Americans lived in teepees, as if the Native American experience could be reduced to living inside a mobile nomadic structure. This produced an incredible misunderstanding of how Native Americans lived, because very few Native Americans actually lived in a teepee. If you go back to that population density map that I showed you earlier, you'll notice that in the Great Plains there were very few Native Americans. Why? Because it had very limited precipitation. Most Native Americans lived along the coastlines, and so their housing of choice did not include the teepee. Rather, they were permanent buildings, such as you would find this wood building on the Pacific Northeast or Northwest, or the mud buildings in the pueblos in what's today New Mexico and Arizona. Well, what's the difference between the wood building and the pueblos? Why didn't the pueblos build out of wood? They didn't have wood. They had a limited supply of wood. They had a lot of clay. And so they took what they had in their environment, the technology they had available, and then made a comfortable shelter for themselves that is both warm in the winter and cool in the summer. On the other hand, on the Pacific Northwest, there's plenty of wood. Not a problem to build a wood structure. On the Great Plains, they had buffalo. They were able to take that skin and turn it into a portable shelter. If we go over to the Atlantic coast, you'll see another type of longhouse. Moving down into the Pacific Southeast, there was a raised feature with no walls. Why in the world would these people not have walls on their houses? Well, if you've ever been to Florida, you realize it's just too hot. To live inside of a house with walls would provide too much insulation, particularly in the summertime. And so by having it raised off the ground, it prevents the moisture in the swamp and the snakes and all the other critters that want to climb up, but it provides an open ventilation with shelter from constant rainfall. So Native American houses reflected the environments in which they lived. Native Americans, like other peoples around the world, simply adapted to them, and they developed their cultures around the buildings that they had. Some of the most fascinating discoveries come from the Amazon. This is a recreation of an Amazonian village based upon LiDAR readings from the region that strip away the trees and allow scholars to look what was under the earth and find the foundations of houses. So here you see an Amazonian village, a typical Amazonian village, that is connected to its neighbors by wide boulevards or roadways. This was an extensive civilization that was lost to scholarship until just the last decade. Another site in South America is Machu Picchu. This is much more well known. But here, the Incans went up into the mountains and created a royal palace, a city of the sun. Now, we're not really sure whether this was purely ceremonial, purely a palace, but we do know this was able to hold and maintain a thriving community for hundreds of years. And so the Incans, like anyone else in the world, were able to adapt some of the most extreme human environments. Humans are incredibly resourceful. Another way to look at Native American diversity is to look at food supply. Not all Native Americans ate buffalo. That was something special to the plains, and very few Native Americans actually lived on the Great Plains. Instead, what did they eat? Well, they ate small game. Rabbits, birds, ducks, fish, whatever was available in the region, humans were able to hunt, to gather, to clean, to cook, to eat. Then there were regional meat varieties. Obviously the buffalo in the Great Plains. Up north into what's today Canada had caribou. In the Pacific North Coast was salmon. Rich salmon runs where salmons lived in the oceans but went up the rivers to spawn. Those provided rich sources of protein and fish oils. Along the Pacific coast were seals. On the East Coast, as well as the West Coast, were whales. And so Native Americans were whalers. In each case, Native Americans developed the technology needed to hunt and thrive on these large meat suppliers. What happens, however, if there's no large game? Well, Southeast American Indians, Southwest American Indians, Central American Indians learned to grow the three sisters: maize, squash, beans. This was an incredibly successful pairing. The maize, the corn, was domesticated somewhere around 4000 before the Common Era, provided a trellis for beans to grow. And so it was a beanstalk. Underneath the maize was squash. And so squash provided an artificial mulch that reduced the amount of evaporation around the corn plant. The corn stalk also provided shade for the squash. So together they provided three constant staples of corn, squash, beans. And so without a major meat supply like buffalo, caribou, salmon, seals, whales, Southeast and Southwest Native Americans were able to transform themselves into agriculture and feed their communities. Some of the more exotic things that came out of the Americas were chilies. This was a spice. Not a lot of nutritional value in chilies, but they make things tasty. A New World product that did provide some nutrition as well as taste were potatoes and tomatoes. These came out of Central and South America. The potato in particular was an incredible changer in world history because it was easy to grow, it was high in calories, and could take on whatever flavor people wanted to impart. Incas learned how to freeze dry it. In the cold, dry air of the mountains, Incans left these potatoes outside, freeze dried them, preserved them for storage, and then when they wanted to eat, boiled them to rehydrate and made something yummy. No matter how you look at it then, these were not one people. Up and down the continents, Native Americans adapted themselves to the climates and environments that they found themselves in. They used the tools that they had to grow and to prosper. They developed languages, they developed housing, they developed different cooking techniques. There was not one Native American peoples. These were peoples that were just as diverse as you would find someone in Paris, or you would find someone in Egypt, or find someone in Peking. That diversity was just as rich and just as thriving as you would find anywhere in Africa, Europe, or Asia.